Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander, I'm BK. If you didn't know, you could join our conversation over on Discord, just follow the link in the description. You can also follow us on Instagram for some extra behind the scenes and meatball content. We even recently just shared a Commander Masters preview card, so definitely check us out there. In today's game we have Busterkins playing Tom Bombadil. This is Saga Tribal. He's going to churn through his deck and get free sagas all the time. Next is Kovacs playing Miirym, Sentinel Worm. When his dragons enter the battlefield, he's going to make copies of dragons, even if they're legendary. It's a problem. Jodah is being piloted by Chris. Wooberg, Legendary Cascade Tribal. What? And I'm playing one of my favorite decks of this year, Sidar Jabari. It's Esper Knight Tribal that reanimates my knights. I don't care if they die at all. Let's get into the game, but please be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Busterkins started things off by playing a Ketria Triome and passing to Kovacs, who plays a Steam Vents, takes 2 life, and then casts Ponder. So he'll look at the top 3 cards of his library. He could put them back in any order. In this case, he decides to shuffle it up and draw a random card. On to Chris's turn, he plays Rafine's Tower as his land for turn, and then says go, over to me. I draw it and play a tapped Watery Grave. I'm not in a hurry. Over to Busterkins' turn 2, Zayator's Proving Ground hits his battlefield, then he says go, back over to Kovacs. He plays a tapped Path of Ancestry. Naming Dragon, I think, might make sense. Over to Chris's turn, he plays Rogren Triome in that beautiful showcase art. Then he also has to say go, back over to me, and my deck falls over.
Oh.
New sleeves problem. Am I right? I play an island, and then I cast Swiftfoot Boots, lining up my next turn with a hasty thing, maybe. On Busterkins' turn, he plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, and then he casts Enchantress's Presence. So now his enchantments might draw him some cards. He passes the turn over to Kovacs, who draws and plays Rockfall Vale as a land, and he decides he wants more lands and casts Farseek. So he'll go find a Plains, Island, Swamp, or Mountain card. He grabs a Cinderglade out of his deck, and he passes the turn over to Chris, who drops a Swamp. Swamp drop! And then he casts his Sadness, which hits the stack. When he passes the turn over to me, I play Shattered Sanctum as my land, and then I cast Worthy Knight. She's so worthy! Then I equip Worthy Knight with my Swiftfoot Boots, making it super fast. And then I go to combat at Busterkins. On the attack, it triggers my commander, so I'll draw a card and discard a card. In this case, it's an Ariel. Then Busterkins takes his beats before I pass. He plays Verdant Catacombs as his land. Then he'll cast Jugan Defends the Temple. On the stack, it triggers his Enchantress's Presence, drawing him a card. Then he gets a 1/1 Human Monk that taps for manas. Mana Monk. He cracks his Verdant Catacombs, taking 1 life, and then he'll go and find a land out of his library. He finds Godless Shrine and has that enter the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2. He uses that then to cast a Soul Ring. With that out, he'll pass the turn over to Kovacs, who plays his own Command Tower as his land for turn and casts the Bath Song, which, by the way, he refused to sing the Bath Song when he played that, and I was offended. Its first chapter says, draw 2 and discard 1. He does so and passes the turn over to Chris, who plays an island, and then he casts Radadrabic of Urborg. This thing will make his dead stuff into zombies that still have their text. On my turn, I play a Plains, and then I move into combat at Kovacs, triggering Sidar from the command zone, so I'll draw a card and discard a card. I discard a Hakon, which is really good. After I deal damage to Kovacs, I move to second main phase and cast Hakon from my graveyard, because that's what he says he does. This triggers Worthy Knight, and I get a 1/1 before passing over to Busterkins. On his turn, he draws, triggers his Saga, gets a +1/+1 counter on his human, plays Karn's Bastion, and then casts his commander, Tom Bombadil. Then he passes over to Kovacs, he draws, and then triggers his Saga, so he'll draw 2 more and discard a card. He then casts Cultivate, getting 2 lands, which is a mountain onto the battlefield tapped, and a forest into his hand. With that, he'll cast Dragonlord's Servant, reducing the cost of his Dargans. He passes and Chris gets reckless. You gotta watch this guy. So, onto his turn, he'll draw, and then he'll play the World Tree, which enters tapped, but if he gets 1 more land out, his lands become better lands. Then he'll move into combat with his Vigilancy thing at me. I declare Chump Block with my human. That's what they're there for. On my turn, I play a Plains. Then I cast my commander, Sidar Jabari of Zalfir. Worthy Knight makes me another 1/1 human. With Sidar out, I move to equip my fast shoes, and in response, Chris casts Anguished Unmaking on Sidar, which is probably correct. He loses 3 life, and Sidar Jabari goes back to my command zone. And I wish I could attack into Chris, but I can't, so I'll attack Hakon towards Kovacs, therefore triggering my commander and putting another knight into my bin. Kovacs takes his beats, and I pass over to Busterkins. He draws, triggers Jugan, so its final chapter will resolve, exiling it, returning it to the battlefield as a remnant of the Rising Star. This also triggered Tom Bombadil. Busterkins will start churning through his deck, revealing the first saga that he comes across. In this case, it's the Akroan War, and then that gets put onto the battlefield. It'll trigger, and he'll gain control of my Hakon. Hey, man. He follows that up by casting Sidar Enchanter, so now he'll get to draw more cards when he casts his sagas. Or a Calyx, guided by fate. So he has 2 card draws hit the stack, and once Calyx enters the battlefield, he pays 1 into Remnant, as well as puts the +1/+1 counter from Calyx on him proper. Then he moves Tom into combat at me. Die, human.
Oh, that's what humans there for.
Busterkins passes, and onto Kovacs' turn, he draws, and then he triggers the Bath Song. So he puts all of his cards from his graveyard back into his library, shuffles up, and then floats 2 blue manas. Then using that blue mana and some of his lands, he casts his commander, Miirym, Sentinel Worm. He used Path of Ancestry in order to do so he'll scry the top card of his library and keep it there. The Bath Song goes away, then he casts Scaled Nurturer. When that enters the battlefield, Miirym will trigger, getting another Scaled Nurturer for him, represented here by a copy token underneath it. He passes the turn over to Chris, who plays Steam Vents, entering the battlefield untapped. He casts his commander, Jodah, the Unifier. Now all he needs to do is start casting other legendary spells in order to cascade. Then he casts Soul Ring. Then he moves into combat with Radadrebic at me, and I just decide to take it. Now I should have lost 2 more life here, but we correct that in a little bit. Chris passed, and over to me. I draw and play a Sunken Hollow as my land for turn, entering the battlefield untapped, of course. Then I cast Herald's Horn, reducing the cost of my knights. Then I cast Adaptive Automaton, who unfortunately his cost is not reduced because it's not a knight until it ETBs. I pass the turn to Busterkins. He draws, and then Akroan War triggers, so all of his opponent's creatures have to attack this turn. Then he casts Birth of the Imperium. On the stack, he gets 2 card draw triggers, and when that enters the battlefield, he'll get an Astartes Warrior, as well as Calyx will get another +1/+1 counter on it. He also tapped his Monk to pay for Remnant to give the Astartes Warrior a counter. Then he moves to combat at me, and then I chump block with my Worthy Knight. I definitely did not want him making a copy of a saga he has out. He passes the turn to Kovacs, who plays the One Ring. So Kovacs gains protection from everything this turn. Then he'll cast Ancient Copper Dragon. He used his Scaled Nurturers to help pay for that, so he'll gain 4 life, as well as a Scry from Path of Ancestry, shipping that card to the bottom of his library. And of course, when it entered the battlefield, he gets a copy of it. He activates the One Ring, putting a burden counter on it, drawing a card, playing an island as his land. Then because of a Akroan War, he has to attack with his eligible creatures. Miirym at Busterkins and Servant at me. I block with my Automaton, and Busterkins blocks with his Remnant, killing it dead. On Chris's turn, he plays Xander's Lounge, entering the battlefield tapped. Then he casts Odric, Lunarch Marshal. This thing's great, and when it hits the stack, Jodah triggers, so Chris will start cascading into a 3-drop or less legendary card. So after churning through a decent portion of his deck, he finds a Kamal's Druidic Vow.
Oh, no! Okay, so I will cast this with 0. I get to look at the top 0 cards in my library and may put any number of land and or legendary permanent cards with converted mana cost 0 or less from among them on the battlefield.
That's so good.
Pretty good, right?
Not bad. After his disappointment resolves, he casts Sky Shroud Claim. This will allow him to go fetch up 2 forest cards. In this case, it'll be a Spara's Headquarters and a Zagoth Triome. They both enter the battlefield tapped, of course, and then Chris moves into combat, swinging Radadrebic as well as Jodah at Busterkins. On combat, Chris's legendary creatures get +3/+3, so Busterkins decides to chump his Jodah, but takes the damage from Radadrebic. I get a trigger off of Herald's Horn, and I reveal a Herald of Hoofbeats off the top of my library. That goes into my hand, and then I draw proper for turn. I play Reflecting Pool as my land, then I recast my commander, Sidar Jabari, and that's when I remember Akroan War was a thing. So I don't equip my Swiftfoot Boots to it, and I just attack with my Adaptive Automaton, a reckless attack at Chris, but it triggered my commander, so I draw and discard an Order of Night. Adaptive Automaton dies when he blocks. After combat, I equip my boots to my commander, and thinking that I'm just like super smart, I realize Birth of the Imperium is a thing. So Busterkins draws, Akroan War triggers, things will deal damage to themselves if they're tapped. Miirym kills itself, and then Birth of the Imperium says each opponent sacks a creature.
I didn't realize you had that. Oh no.
Here I was thinking I was skillfully navigating around a Akroan War. Chris sacks Odric, and Radadrebic says make a copy that's a zombie, and Kovacs lost one of his Dragon Dorks. With Akroan War gone, I get Hakon back. Busterkins resolves Tom's triggered ability when the Akroan War was resolved, so he gets the Eldest Reborn. That enters the battlefield, Calyx gets a +1/+1 counter, and each opponent sacks a creature. So my newly returned Hakon has to get sacrificed. I lose 2 life when it dies. Jodah is sacrificed by Chris, but again, he makes a a copy that's not legendary because of Redadrabic, and Kovacs sacked his servant. As a follow-up play to basically wiping the board, Busterkins says, here's Elspeth Conquers Death, so he gets 2 draw triggers on the stack, and then when that enters the battlefield, Calyx gets a +1/+1 counter, and he gets to target something to exile. In this case, it'll be the Ancient Copper Dragon. Kovacs still has a copy of it though, so we represent it like that. Then he drops Urza's Saga, so this will also trigger Calyx once it ETBs, because it is an enchantment. Then he casts Verduran Enchantress, another thing that lets him draw cards, and keep his engine churning. Probably pretty good. Then he moves into combat, swinging Calyx at me, because I'm an open target. Once it resolves damage, it makes a copy of one of his enchantments. So he chooses Elspeth Conquers Death. That comes in as a copy. Again, Calyx sees it enter the battlefield, and then he gets to exile the other Ancient Copper Dragon. And with that explosive turn wrapped up, he passes to Kovacs, who loses 1 life on his upkeep thanks to the One Ring. Then he activates the One Ring, drawing a card and putting a burden counter on it. He casts Gratuitous Violence. This thing would have been terrifying if he still had his board state from last turn. He casts Territorial Hellkite. Using Path of Ancestry, he gets a Scry and keeps it on top. He moves into combat, randomly selected at Busterkins, and he drops to 17 because of Gratuitous Violence. On Chris's turn, he recasts his commander Jodah the Unifier, and Zombie Jodah the Unifier says, yo, Cascade! So he starts revealing cards from the top until he finds a Kethis, the Hidden Hand. He gets to cast that for free, because that's what Jodah does. Now his legendary spells are cheaper. He casts Hero's Podium, so Jodah and Jodah Zombie are like, do that not Cascade, but basically Cascade thing. So he starts churning through the top of his library, exiling all of these cards until he finds something that's 4 mana value or less and legendary. He gets a Thran Temporal Gateway onto the battlefield for free. So if he's desperate, he can pop out something from his hand onto the battlefield. Then Jodah's second trigger ability goes off and he gets a Yoshimaru Ever Faithful off the top of his library. Hero's Podium and both Jodahs are pumping his legendary creatures a ton, so he smashes into Kovacs for 14 damage with Redadrabic, and the 2/2/2 zombies attack me for 4, because they're not legendary. My turn, Herald's Horn is triggered, and I reveal a Dauntless Bodyguard and put it into my hand, then draw for turn. I play Drowned Catacomb as my land.
I can't believe I cast my commander into your this.
I mean, to be fair, I didn't really know what it did either.
Just reflecting on my mistake. I recast Hakon Stromgald Scourge from my graveyard, and I get to do that for cheap. Then I start casting creatures out of my graveyard. I'll start with Worthy Knight. She's so worthy. I cast Knight of Grace. This triggers Worthy Knight because it is a cast out of the graveyard. Then I cast Ariel, Knight of Windgrace, again getting another 1/1 thanks to Worthy Knight. And with only 1 mana remaining, I decide to equip Ariel with my super fast boots and use her to go attacking Kovacs, seeing as there's no point in attacking Busterkin's board. This triggers my commander. I draw and discard Herald of Hoofbeats. Kovacs goes to 20 and I pass over to Busterkins, who draws, and then he starts resolving the next chapters of each of his sagas. Thanks to Conquer's Death, our non-creature spells cost a total of 4 more to cast. We all have to discard a card thanks to the Eldest Reborn, and Birth tells Busterkins to draw 2 cards. With its final chapter resolved, Tom Bombadil will trigger, so Busterkins will look at the top cards of his library until he found the Trickster God's Heist. And when that enters the battlefield, Calyx will get another +1/+1 counter on it, as well as he'll exchange control of 2 things. In this case, it's a Verduran Enchantress for Chris's Jodah, because 2 Jodahs is just too good. And with that dastardly deal out of the way, Busterkins casts Inventive Iteration. Hitting the stack draws him 2 cards, thanks to his enchantresses. Then, when it enters the battlefield, he gets a Calyx trigger, and he targets my Hakon to be returned to my hand, which is probably good, seeing as I can't cast it from there. Then he casts Hidetsugu Consumes All. This will again get him some card draw, and destroy everything of mana value 1 or less. With some tokens and soul rings out of the way, he moves into combat with Calyx, and I chump block with my Knight of Grace. He then passes the turn over to Kovacs, who loses 2 life because of the One Ring. He draws. He then decides he wants to draw more, activating the One Ring once again. It's so tempting. He plays a Rootbound Crag, a fancy secret layer drop. Then he casts Kindred Discovery. Thanks to the pair of Elspeth Conquers Deaths from Busterkin's board, he had to pay 9 whole mana for that, really valuing his card draw to dig him out of this mess. He goes to combat, again randomly choosing to attack Chris, and because he deals damage, he not only gets a card draw, but Gratuitous Violence also says deal a lot more. He passes the turn over to Chris, who's looking for gas. In his first main phase, he activates Hero's Podium for 3. He'll look at the top 3 looking for a legendary, and he finds a Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. He puts that to his hand, and then immediately casts Sisay. And when that hits the stack, his dead Jodah zombie says, hey, you could still do my legendary Cascade-like ability. So he goes digging into his library, exiling all the cards until he finds Raugrok, son of Roga. He gets to cast that for free, not only because it's 0, but because of his not Cascade ability. Chris moves into combat, and Dead Jodah plus Heroes Podium pump the legendary team, and Odric is giving most of the keywords in the game to all of those creatures as well. He's terrifying, and he passes the turn over to me. I find Banalish Marshal to my hand because of Herald's Horn. I draw for turn and play Morphic Pool as my land. I think I really need to keep reanimating stuff, so I cast my commander, Sidar Jabari of Zalfir. I get a 1/1 thanks to Worthy Knight, MVP. Then I equip my Swiftfoot Boots. I move into combat with my commander at Chris, who needs to be taken down a peg or two, as well as Ariel towards Kovacs. On the attack, I get a trigger for my commander, I get to draw a card, and I discard that Banalish Marshal. I connect with Chris, as well as deal damage to Kovacs. And because my commander dealt combat damage, I get to bring out a Herald of Hoofbeats back from my graveyard onto the battlefield for free. I cast Dauntless Bodyguard as a follow-up, triggering Worthy Knight once again, getting a human. And once that enters the battlefield, I have Dauntless Bodyguard protect my Herald of Hoofbeats. On Busterkin's turn, he has all the triggers in the world after he draws. So after he puts all of his lore counters out on his sagas, the first thing is, Inventive Iteration will get him his Soul Ring back from the graveyard to his hand. Then, the Eldest Reborn looks at my graveyard, and he takes the Banalish Marshal from me, pumping his whole team. One Elspeth Conquers Death triggers has him bring back Starfield Mystic from his graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. And he'll do the same for the Satyr Enchanter with the other Elspeth Conquers Death. Then, Hidetsugu consumes all of our graveyards by exiling them, and he decides not to bother with the Urza Saga or the Trickster God's Heist. Then, Tom Bombadil will trigger, and the first card off the top is another saga, the Horus Heresy. So for each opponent, he gains control of one of their things. He takes my Herald of Hoofbeats from Chris, he takes the Odric Zombie token, and from Kovacs, he takes the Territorial Hellkite. And to really twist the knife, he casts Vorinclex. This will trigger his stolen Jodah when Vorinclex is cast, so he will not Cascade, and find Sithis, Harvest's hand. He'll get to draw more, and Calyx will get bigger. Now with all those extra legendaries out, Jodah will pump his team more, and because of his Odric, they all have crazy text.
You guys just do math now, I guess.
Uh-oh. They also have horsemanship.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, the answer's it's only night.
Horsemanship wasn't really impactful there, it was just a joke. But all the other keywords did matter: flying, haste, trample, etc. Congratulations, Busterkin, after smashing into us. Job well done. Here's Meatball. He's so chunky. There you have it, that's the game. What did you think of this variety game featuring new commanders and some slightly older ones as well? We had a lot of fun playing this one. We really like to see the variety of the matchups. Let us know what you thought in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thank you for watching.